The clock on the nightstand read 2:13 a.m. Alessandro Moretti had not moved in 40 minutes. He lay on his back, eyes closed, chest rising and falling in the slow, even rhythm of a man deep in sleep. His hands were relaxed at his sides. His breathing was controlled. 4 counts in, 4 counts out. The kind of stillness that took years to master. To anyone watching, he was unconscious. He was the most awake he'd been in weeks. This was something people misunderstood about Alessandro. They feared his violence, his reach, the way a single phone call from him could rearrange the architecture of a man's life. But the thing that had kept him alive for 41 years, through 3 wars, 2 assassination attempts, and more betrayals than he could count on both hands, wasn't his temper. It was his patience. It was the fact that he noticed everything. He noticed it 3 weeks ago. Not a fight. Not a suspicious phone call left open on the counter. Nothing so obvious. It was smaller than that. Quieter. The night he came home from Palermo, Isabella had kissed him at the door the way she always did. Hands on his chest, lips soft, eyes closing. But there had been a pause. Half a second. A fraction of a breath where her body arrived before her mind did. He felt it, the way you feel a crack in a floorboard beneath carpet. You don't see it. You feel it through the sole of your shoe. He said nothing. He watched. He noticed the laugh that stopped too fast at dinner the following Friday, when he made a joke he'd made a dozen times before. He noticed the way she reached for her wine glass, a beat too quickly afterward, like she needed something to do with her hand. He noticed that 3 times in the past 2 weeks, she had checked her phone and then set it face down on the table, with the particular carefulness of someone who had practiced making it look casual. And then there was Matteo. Matteo Caruso had driven for Alessandro for 9 years. He was 34, quiet, loyal, in the way that certain dogs are loyal, not out of affection, but out of a deep structural need for order. Alessandro trusted him the way he trusted very few people. Not completely, but enough. Enough to let him near the house, near Isabella. 3 weeks ago, at dinner, Isabella had looked at Matteo as he refilled the water glasses. It lasted less than a second, and then she looked away. That look. Alessandro had seen 1,000 looks in his life. He could read a negotiating table like a chessboard, anticipate the lie before the mouth opened, feel the shift in a room the moment loyalty changed hands. That look between Isabella and Matteo wasn't desire. It was weight. It was the look of 2 people carrying something they could not put down. He had spent 3 weeks deciding what to do about it. 3 weeks of watching, waiting, giving nothing away. Tomorrow was their wedding. 200 guests. The Conti family flying in from Naples. His mother, finally, after years of resistance, had agreed to attend. He had almost convinced himself he was wrong. And then, at 2:13 a.m., the bedroom door clicked open, and the whisper began. Alessandro did not move. Not a finger. Not an eyelid. He breathed. 4 counts in, 4 counts out, and he listened with the focused, terrible attention of a man whose survival had always depended on what other people said when they believed no one was listening. Isabella's feet were bare. He could tell by the sound, the near-silent press of skin on marble, careful and deliberate, the walk of someone who had rehearsed this. The bedroom door closed behind her with a softness that was almost loving. For a moment, silence. Then, muffled through the door, her voice. He's asleep. A pause. I checked. A longer silence. She was on the phone. Alessandro's jaw tightened imperceptibly. Matteo, just listen to me. Her voice was low, controlled, but threaded through with something fragile. Not guilt, exactly. Something older than guilt. Something that had been carried so long it had changed shape. After tomorrow's wedding, He'll never know the truth. Alessandro's heart did not race. It stopped, one full beat of silence inside his chest, and then it resumed, slower, colder, more deliberate than before. He kept his breathing even. He kept his hands still. He lay in the dark, and he listened to the woman he had loved for 6 years tell another man that she had been lying to him. Matteo's voice was too low to carry clearly through the door. Alessandro caught fragments. "Can't keep doing this." And, "You promised, after the engagement." And then something that sounded like a name, swallowed before it fully formed. "I know what I promised," Isabella said. The fragility sharpened into something harder. "But this is bigger than what either of us planned for. You know that." Planned for. Alessandro turned the phrase over in his mind like a stone, examining its edges. Not expected, not imagined, planned for. The language of people who had set something in motion, intentionally. "It's been over a year, Matteo." Her voice dropped lower. He had to focus to catch it. Over a year, and he has never once. She stopped herself, exhaled. "He trusts me completely. You know how rare that is for a man like him. That's exactly why we can't let this fall apart now. Not tonight. Not when we're this close." This close. Alessandro's mind worked in silence, assembling fragments into architecture. An affair would not require a year of coordinated silence. An affair would not require Matteo, a driver, not a lover. A man whose value to Isabella had always been proximity to Alessandro, not to her. An affair would not be described as something you could let fall apart like a plan. This was not an affair. It was something more structured than that. "The moment the ceremony is done," Isabella continued, "everything changes. For both of us. For all three." She stopped again. Hard this time, like she'd almost said a number that wasn't supposed to be spoken aloud. All three. Alessandro's eyes opened in the dark. He stared at the ceiling, the hand-plastered plaster, the shadow of the ceiling fan motionless above him, and he felt the geometry of his entire life begin to rearrange itself around that phrase. Matteo's voice again, closer to the door now, urgent. Alessandro caught 2 words clearly. The account. And then Isabella, quieter than she'd been yet. He can never find out about Torino. Torino, a city. Alessandro had holdings in Torino, accounts, a property he hadn't visited in 2 years, a name he hadn't thought about in almost as long, a name attached to a piece of business he'd considered resolved. The name surfaced now from the back of his memory, like something rising through dark water. And the moment it did, the shape of the last 6 years shifted beneath him, like ground that had never been solid. The bedroom door pressed open again, bare feet on marble. The soft exhale of a woman who believed her sleeping fiancé had heard nothing. Isabella slipped back into bed beside him. He closed his eyes. He did not sleep for the rest of the night. He now knew 2 things for certain. The woman beside him had been lying since before she loved him, and someone else had been watching the whole time. Isabella's breathing slowed into sleep within minutes. Alessandro lay beside her and did not move. This was the part no one understood about grief, the way it arrived not as an explosion, but as a slow, total silence, like pressure equalizing in a sealed room. He felt it move through him now, floor to ceiling, filling every corner, and he let it. He had learned long ago that a man who fights his own grief wastes the energy he needs to survive it. So he lay still, and he remembered. He remembered the night they met, a gallery opening in Palermo. 3 years after his wife Elena had died, 3 years of a life so deliberately emptied of softness that his own men had started to worry about him in the quiet way men like them worried, which was to say nothing, but to watch carefully. Isabella had been standing in front of a painting he'd never liked, holding a glass of wine she hadn't touched. And when he approached, she had said, without turning, "It's technically perfect and completely hollow, like most powerful things." He had laughed. He could not remember the last time he had laughed before that. He remembered the first time he told her something he had never told anyone. 4 months in, a terrace in Taormina, the sea below them, her hand in both of his. He told her about Elena, about the year after, about the specific shape of a silence that follows a love you didn't protect carefully enough. Isabella had not offered comfort. She had simply listened, her eyes steady on his. And when he finished, she said, "You're allowed to still be that person and also be this one." He had decided that night she was different. He remembered the moment he stopped protecting himself from her. It was not dramatic. It was a Tuesday. She had been reading on the sofa when he came in, and she looked up and smiled. Not the practiced smile she gave at dinners and events, but the half-distracted one, the unguarded one, and something in him simply laid down its weapons. He had never done that for anyone, not once, in 41 years. He stared at the ceiling now and let each memory stand in the new light. The night they met, had she known who he was before she turned around? The gallery had not been accidental to his schedule. He had confirmed the event only that afternoon. The terrace in Taormina. She had asked the questions that led him to Elena, gently, naturally, the way a surgeon opens a chest. The Tuesday she looked up from her book. What had she been reading? He had never thought to ask. He thought of it now. He thought of how perfectly ordinary she had always seemed in the moments that mattered most. The tenderness had been real. He was almost certain of that. But tenderness, he understood now, was not the same as truth. A person could feel genuine warmth for someone they were also using. The human heart was large enough to hold both. That was what made this particular kind of betrayal so complete. It left him nothing clean to stand on, not even his own memory. He did not cry. He never cried. But somewhere beneath the stillness, something that had been quietly alive in him for 6 years went very, very quiet. By 4:47 a.m., Alessandro knew everything. He had not left the bed. He had not made a single call. He had simply lain in the dark and thought, with the cold, methodical precision of a man who had built an empire by understanding that most problems, stripped of their emotion, were just sequences of cause and effect waiting to be traced back to their origin. And he had traced this one all the way back. Torino. 18 months ago, Alessandro had finalized the acquisition of a logistics company in Torino, a mid-size operation with clean books and useful routes through northern Italy into Switzerland. The previous owner, a man named Gennaro Ferrante, had walked away from the deal cleanly, or so Alessandro had believed. What he understood now, assembling the fragments from the hallway, the account, Torino, all 3 of us, he'll never know the truth, was that Ferrante had not walked away at all. Ferrante had sent someone in first. Isabella Romano had grown up in a small town 40 kilometers outside Torino. Alessandro had known that. He had known her background, verified it the way he verified everything, or so he believed. What he had not known, what no one on his team had surfaced, was that Isabella's older brother, Luca, had worked for Ferrante for 11 years, that Luca currently owed a debt to Ferrante that no amount of legitimate income could service, and that the price of that debt's forgiveness had been his sister, placed, deliberately, at a gallery in Palermo, 3 years after Elena, when Alessandro was, by any honest measure, the most vulnerable he had ever been. And Matteo, loyal, quiet, structural Matteo, had been Ferrante's man first, not a traitor who turned. a plant who waited. 9 years of patience for a moment exactly like this one, the night before the wedding, when Alessandro's accounts, his properties, his legal holdings, would by Sicilian marital custom become partially accessible to a spouse. When the transfer of certain documents Alessandro kept in a private archive that only a wife could legally petition for, would become not just possible, but simple. That was what Isabella had meant. After tomorrow's wedding, he'll never know the truth. Not an affair. Not a theft in the ordinary sense. A long, quiet 6-year excavation of everything he was, everything he owned, executed by a woman who, and this was the part he kept returning to, the part that complicated the clean lines of his anger, had somewhere along the way made the grave mistake of actually falling in love with him. He had heard it in her voice in the hallway. The fracture beneath the plan, the exhaustion of a person carrying something they had never wanted to carry this long. You know how rare that is for a man like him. She had not said it like a strategist. She had said it like a woman who understood, too late, the precise weight of what she was about to destroy. It did not forgive her, but it changed the shape of what came next. At 5:52 a.m., the first pale light pressed through the curtains. Alessandro rose from the bed without sound. He showered. He dressed. Dark suit, white shirt, no tie yet. He stood at the mirror and studied his own face for a long moment. Composed, unreadable, exactly as it needed to be. Isabella slept on. The wedding was in 8 hours. He picked up his phone and made one call. 3 words spoken quietly before he ended it. Find Luca Romano. Then he walked downstairs, poured himself a coffee, and waited for the day to begin. By 9 o'clock, the villa was alive. Florists moved through the courtyard in coordinated waves. White roses, Isabella's choice, covered every surface that could hold them. The string quartet was rehearsing near the fountain. Caterers rolled carts across the stone path, with the focused urgency of people who understood that a Moretti event had no tolerance for disorder. Alessandro stood at the top of the entrance steps and greeted his guests like a man without a single thing on his mind. Don Conti. A handshake, firm and warm. You look well. How is Naples treating you? Alessandro. His cousin Marco embracing him. Today's the day, eh? You nervous? Not even slightly. A smile, unhurried, genuine in all the ways that mattered for appearances. He moved through the morning the way he moved through every high-stakes situation, with a stillness so complete that the people around him felt calm, simply by proximity. He accepted congratulations. He laughed at the right moments. He adjusted his cufflinks at the mirror in the antechamber and noted, with the detached precision of a man cataloging assets, that he looked exactly like a groom. Beneath the surface, the machinery had been running for hours. The first call, at 5:52 a.m., find Luca Romano. By 8, his man in Torino had confirmed Luca's location. A rented apartment in the Crocetta district. Confirmation received. The second call, at 7. A lawyer Alessandro trusted above all others. A man who had restructured 3 of his most sensitive holdings in a single afternoon, and never asked questions he wasn't supposed to ask. A set of documents quietly redirected. Certain accounts rendered untouchable before the ceremony began. The third call, at 8:15. 4 words to his head of security. Stay close to Matteo. He had not spoken to Matteo directly all morning, but twice he had felt the man's eyes on him. That careful measuring look of someone checking for cracks in a surface. Both times, Alessandro had given him nothing. Not coldness, which would have registered. Not warmth, which would have felt wrong. Simply the ordinary, unremarkable face of a man moving through his wedding morning. Matteo had looked away, satisfied. That was the mistake people made with Alessandro, always. They looked for the storm. They watched for the moment his face changed, his jaw set, his eyes hardened into the thing that made men step back without knowing why. They braced for the visible signal. They never understood that by the time Alessandro showed you anything, the decision had already been made, the pieces already placed, and the outcome already certain. Isabella found him 20 minutes before the ceremony. She was radiant. There was no other word for it. Ivory dress, dark hair swept up, eyes bright with something that looked unmistakably like happiness. She took his hands in both of hers and looked up at him, the way she had 10,000 times before. "I love you," she said. Quiet. Just for him. "I need you to know that. Whatever happens, I love you." He looked at her for a long moment. Whatever happens. She did not know she had just told him everything. He smiled, warm, slow. The smile she had said once was the one she'd fallen for. And he brought her hands to his lips. "I know," he said. She believed him completely. The chapel held 200 people, and the particular silence of a room full of the powerful, pretending to be sentimental. Alessandro stood at the altar and watched Isabella walk toward him. She was beautiful. He let himself see that clearly, without softening it or using it against himself. She was beautiful, and she was walking down the aisle of a chapel in Sicily toward a man she had been sent to destroy. And somewhere in the 6 years between her assignment and this moment, she had made the catastrophic mistake of meaning it. He watched her face as she approached. Open, luminous. The face of a woman who had somehow convinced herself that love was a retroactive absolution, that if you felt it truly enough at the end, it rewrote everything that came before. He almost understood it. The priest began. Alessandro stood with his hands clasped in front of him and kept his breathing even and let the ceremony move forward with the unhurried momentum of a thing already decided. Around him, 200 guests settled into the reverent, collective stillness of witnesses. His mother sat in the front row, hands folded, eyes glistening. The Conti family occupied the third row. Matteo stood near the side entrance in his dark suit, the only member of the wedding party not seated, positioned there by Alessandro, who had told him he wanted a trusted face visible from the altar. Matteo had been quietly pleased by that. The vows began. Isabella first. She had written her own. He had known that, had agreed to it months ago. She spoke clearly, voice only slightly unsteady, and the words were genuine in the way that made them almost unbearable to hear. She spoke about patience, about a man who had taught her the difference between safety and surrender, about choosing, every day, the same person. 200 people exhaled softly at the end of it. The priest turned to Alessandro. He was quiet for a moment. 1 beat. 2. Isabella's smile held, but something moved beneath it. The faintest flicker of a woman whose body understood something her mind had not yet processed. Alessandro looked at her. Then, slowly, he looked out at the room. His gaze moved across the assembled guests with the calm, unhurried authority of a man who owned every second of silence he created. When he spoke, his voice was low, perfectly controlled, the kind of quiet that a room full of people instinctively leans toward. "I'm not going to say my vows today." The air changed. "What I'm going to do instead," he continued, "is tell everyone in this room something that the woman standing across from me and the man standing at the side entrance believed I would never know." Isabella's bouquet trembled. 18 months ago, a man named Gennaro Ferrante made an investment. The investment was a woman, this woman, placed beside me at a gallery in Palermo 3 years after I lost my wife, because someone had done enough research to know exactly when I would be easiest to reach. He paused. The plan was simple. Get close, get the ring, get the marriage certificate, and then get access to documents and accounts that a Moretti wife under Sicilian law could petition for legally. The chapel was absolutely silent. Isabella's face had gone the color of the white roses behind her. Isabella. He said her name without cruelty, without rage, with something almost worse, the tone of a man delivering a verdict he had already accepted. I heard you last night, every word. She opened her mouth. Nothing came. Alessandro turned his eyes to the side entrance. Matteo had his hand inside his jacket. 3 of Alessandro's men were already there. 2 held his arms before the hand emerged. The 3rd relieved him of what he'd been reaching for with the practiced efficiency of people who had been standing in position for 2 hours, waiting for exactly this moment. Matteo did not struggle. He closed his eyes. The chapel remained perfectly, completely still. 200 people suspended in the held breath of a moment none of them would ever stop describing for the rest of their lives. Alessandro turned back to Isabella. She was crying now. Silent tears, the kind that come before the sound does, the kind that mean the body has understood something the voice hasn't caught up to yet. He looked at her for a long moment. There's more, he said quietly, and you're going to want to hear it. The guests were gone within the hour, not chaotically. Alessandro had seen to that. Quiet words to the right people, cars arranged, the Conti family escorted out with the careful dignity of men who understood that what they had witnessed was not their business to discuss. His mother had left without speaking to him, which meant she was either devastated or furious, and he would deal with that later. Now it was just the 3 of them. Isabella sat in the antechamber off the chapel, still in her wedding dress, hands folded in her lap. Matteo sat across the room, Alessandro's men flanking him, not roughly, but with the unmistakable posture of people who were not going to move. Alessandro stood in the center and said, "Tell me the part I don't know yet." Isabella looked up at him. Her eyes were dry now. Whatever had broken open at the altar had receded into something quieter and more resolved, and he recognized it because he had felt it himself at 2:13 a.m., the particular stillness of a person who has stopped calculating and decided finally to simply tell the truth. Luca didn't just owe Ferrante money, she said. Ferrante had him, completely. There were documents, evidence of something Luca did 11 years ago that would have put him in prison for the rest of his life. She paused. When Ferrante came to me, I didn't have a choice, or I told myself I didn't. That's the version I lived with for a long time. Alessandro said nothing. He waited. The plan was exactly what you described. Get close, get the marriage certificate, get access to the archive. Her voice was level, but it cost her something to keep it that way. What wasn't in the plan was that somewhere in the 2nd year, she stopped, steadied herself. I went back to Ferrante, 18 months ago. I told him I wanted out, that I would find another way to protect Luca. Alessandro's eyes moved to Matteo. Matteo spoke for the first time. His voice was rough, like a man who had been holding something in his chest for too long. She came to me because she had no one else. She couldn't go to her brother. He would have gone straight to Ferrante. She couldn't go to anyone in your circle without it getting back to you. He looked at the floor. I didn't help Ferrante. I want that said clearly. I helped her try to get free of him. The account she mentioned, that was money she'd been moving quietly for a year. Not yours, hers. Building enough leverage to buy Luca's documents back from Ferrante before the wedding. Alessandro was still. The conversation last night, Isabella said. It wasn't about completing the plan. It was about whether we had enough, whether I could go through with the wedding, a real marriage, and still finish what I'd started without you ever knowing where I'd come from. The silence in the room was different now, not the silence of a verdict waiting to be delivered. Something more complicated than that. Alessandro looked at the woman in the white dress and understood that the story he had assembled in the dark, clean, logical, architectural, had been true in its facts and wrong in its meaning. She had been sent as a weapon. She had spent the last 18 months trying to dismantle herself. That did not return the 6 years. It did not unknow the lie at the foundation, but it changed, irrevocably, uncomfortably, the question of who Isabella Romano actually was. He had always valued truth above everything else. The truth he was finding was rarely the shape you expected. By 4 o'clock, the villa was empty. The roses were still everywhere, white, motionless, filling the air with a sweetness that had nowhere to go. The string quartet's chairs sat abandoned in the courtyard. A single champagne flute had been left on the stone wall near the fountain, untouched, still faintly cold. Alessandro walked through it alone. He had made his decisions, all of them, in the order they needed to be made. Ferrante's leverage over Luca Romano had been resolved by midday. Alessandro's lawyer, the same one who had moved the accounts that morning, had acquired the documents through channels that were efficient and final. Luca Romano was a free man by early afternoon, without knowing who had freed him or why, and Alessandro intended to keep it that way. Matteo had been released. Not forgiven, released. 9 years of service counted for something, even at the end of it. He had been given an envelope, a one-way arrangement out of Sicily, and the clear understanding that Alessandro's generosity had a precise and unrenewable expiration. He had taken the envelope without a word and left without looking back. Isabella was gone. Alessandro had told her himself, standing in the antechamber while the chapel emptied. No raised voice, no ultimatum delivered for an audience. Just two people in a quiet room, and the truth laid out between them like a document requiring a signature. "I believe you," he had said, "about what you became, about what you tried to do at the end." He had looked at her steadily. "It doesn't change what was built on." She had nodded. She had not asked for anything different. That, more than anything, had told him he was right about who she had become. The woman Ferrante had sent to Palermo 3 years after, Elena would have argued, would have leveraged the love against the logic. This woman simply stood in the ruins of what she'd built and accepted the weight of it. He had respected that. It had not been enough. He stood now at the edge of the courtyard as the late afternoon light came in low and golden across the stone. Somewhere beyond the villa's walls, Sicily continued its unhurried business. The sea, the traffic, the voices of people whose lives had not been quietly restructured overnight. He thought about Elena. He thought about the Tuesday Isabella had looked up from her book, and he had laid his weapons down. He thought about a gallery in Palermo, and a painting that was technically perfect and completely hollow, and a woman who had turned around and told him so. He thought about the fact that even now, knowing everything, the memory did not feel entirely like a lie. That was the part he would have to learn to carry. A man could survive betrayal. Alessandro had done it before. What took longer, what required the kind of patience even he found difficult, was surviving the discovery that the thing used against you had also, genuinely, been real. He picked up the untouched champagne flute from the stone wall. He set it back down. Then he walked inside, closed the door behind him, and began. Some people will watch this and say Isabella deserved no mercy. Others will say Alessandro should have chosen differently. But here is the question I want to leave you with. If the person who betrayed you spent a year trying to undo it, quietly, at great cost, with no guarantee you'd ever know, does that change anything? Or does a lie at the foundation mean the house always had to come down? Think about that carefully, because your answer says more about you than it does about them.